So James Papez was a neurologist in the United States and a neuroanatomist, who lived from 1883 to 1958. And he proposed a rather influential theory back in the 1930s, in 1937, on the cerebral substrate of emotions. And again, emotions, are going to be actions or movements, some of them visible in, facial expression changes, bodily, adjustments, postural adjustments, things like that, withdrawal from, injury, things like that. But the substrate in the brain, that actually where these changes are mapped in relationship to, an appreciation for potentially what is causing them, and then memories that are consonant with, similar sorts of experiences, constitute the sort of neurological substrate or basis for feelings. At the time, Papez talked about just emotions, sort of meaning collectively sort of emotions and feelings. And he proposed this influential theory that would link the hypothalamic drive centers to areas of the brain, the cortex in particular, that were, thought to be essential, for our feelings of emotion. So, at the time, there was a lot of work on the hypothalamus and how that sort of medial, set of nuclei was essential for maintaining homeostasis, right? For detecting changes from optimal kind of set points or levels of certain aspects of the internal environment of the body, the internal milieu, then utilizing, hormonal and also autonomic, and also kind of behavioral, more complex sort of behavioral responses, to help get the body back into balance. So he reasoned that there had to be sort of a pathway, from the hypothalamus, actual neuronal network, that linked these hypothalamic drive centers to areas of the cortex, to maps in the cortex that would support, our experiences of those emotional, states. The same way that the eyes are connected to, networks in the, the what pathway in the temporal lobe and the where pathway in the parietal lobe, to allow for us to identify, what an object is, to perceive it, and to know where it is. That had to be true of emotional states as well. So he followed the anatomy. So the hypothalamus, there are these output nuclei known as the mammillary bodies, and they project, to, ultimately the information is heading to cortex, but of course, this is sensory information, right, from the body, afferent information, this time from the body. So it has to go through thalamus, right? So he identified a that's from the mammillary bodies, thalamic, tract, and that was the first component of what he referred to as, that's what's now called the Papez Circuit. And then from the thalamus into the frontal lobe, actually into the medial frontal lobe, right? Into this gyrus that's located, around the corpus callosum, right? That borders the corpus callosum. This is called the cingulate gyrus, right? Right here. And this anterior portion of the cingulate gyrus is what receives, information from the thalamus from the hypothalamus via, the thalamus, via the mammillothalamic tract. Then there is a projection into anterior cingulate cortex. And anterior cingulate cortex is really incredibly important. It's a very essential node in a number of distributed networks, across the brain. And it's, in the frontal lobe. So it's involved in sort of behavioral decision making, right? And sort of links to action, right? Based upon, what you're learning from your hypothalamus. It actually gets a very updated somatosensory map, integrating both positional and, proprioceptive aspects of somatosensation that were initially processed in the parietal lobe with visceral, gut, emotionally salient inputs, that are initially mapped at the cortical level in the insular lobe. So there's great insular, kind of anterior cingulate gyrus connectivity. And what's also coming into that cingulate region, in the frontal lobe there, is, drive information, about am I hungry, am I horny, am I thirsty, from the drive center, as Papez would have called it, in the hypothalamus, the specific nuclear that are monitoring the internal milieu, the internal environment. And then from the cingulate gyrus, there's a massive white matter fibers that start to coalesce. They sort of, get more and more extensive as they pull up, additional contributors as you go, more posterior in the cingulate. And they form this great big kind of circling cable that's called the cingulum. And the cingulum comes right into the medial temporal lobes. So including the hippocampus. The medial temporal lobe, of course, these structures are very important for episodic or, explicit, declarative memory for facts, events, experiences, the ability to sort of transfer ongoing kind of working memory experience, like what you're working with right now, things that are happening at this moment, into, some sort of longer term form. And of course, emotional states and the state of the body, actually play a pretty significant role in what we remember and what we recall, right? And then out of the hippocampus comes a, kind of a circling back kind of projection. It's a white matter projection known as the fornix. And the fornix goes right back in to the hypothalamus. So this was a way that you could link, hypothalamic drive centers to cortex. This is a neuroanatomical pathway. And it also linked these, cortical regions back to, these hypothalamic drive centers so that, not only can they influence our behavior and expression, in our felt state, but there's how we think and feel can also go back and kind of influence the expression, in these drive generators to some extent, right? And, Papez was really interested in a particular disease known as rabies, which was transmitted, from animal to animal, including to humans sometimes, via kind of very emotional, attack, kind of like biting, one animal biting another. And some of the concept of the symptoms of rabies, as it progresses, are intense kind of, emotional, action, rage, fear, like lashing out and things like that. And, the rabies organism did quite a bit of, had quite a bit of impact on these neuroanatomical, structures that formed part of this Papez circuit. So that's, some of the early work that was done in kind of illuminating what parts of the brain, are involved in both emotional expression and feeling, our felt